We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kara Oosterhuis, and I am a field editor with Real Agriculture. I am excited to be here as your moderator today for this very exciting webinar. And I myself am actually a University of Calgary Communication and Media Studies grad, so it's always fun to be able to come back and speak on behalf of U of C. So the School of Public Policy and the Simpson Center for Food and Agricultural Policy would like to welcome you to the first event in the Simpson Center Public Education Series. This webinar is exclusively presented by UFA and RCAF, the United Farmers of Alberta, and the UFA Rural Communities Foundation. This is the first of a series of 3 webinars focused on carbon content in our soils and the concept of regenerative agriculture practices that could increase that stored amount of carbon. Today's webinar reviews concepts behind 4 per thousand, the idea that an annual growth rate of 0.4% or 4 parts per 1,000 in the global soil carbon stocks per year in the first 30 to 40 centimeters of soil would significantly reduce the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere related to human activities. Is it real? Is it practical? Could it work? What does it mean for Canada? What policy interventions could enable Canada to work towards this goal if it is seen as pragmatic? So before we get into this topic today, we have a few quick housekeeping options or housekeeping things for you. We will have time for the Q&A after the panel discussion. So we'll have both our panelists speak and then we'll get into the Q&A. So if you have any of those questions, please put them in the Q&A box, but I know how it is. We have questions as they come up. Please put them in the box as you think of them, and we will absolutely get to them. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in today's panelists. Today's panelists are Dr. Francesca Cortrufo, and she is a professor of the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences at Colorado State University, and Dr. Mario Tenuta, who is a professor of soil ecology, Department of Soil Science at the University of Manitoba. We will start today's webinar with Dr. Francesca Cortrufo. So whenever you are ready, please take it away.
Thank you, and it's been a pleasure to be here with you guys today and discuss a topic that actually has been, is central to my research now for several years. So first of all, let's start understanding what does that mean, that 4 per mil, where does it come from, and what the people that started this initiative thought of it. It definitely came from the Lima Paris Action Agenda, and it's supported by the United Nations for Food and Agriculture Organization. And basically, the point was to grab the attention to how much carbon is stored in soils, and thinking that since we do need to abate CO2 from the atmosphere, if we managed our land in a way that we could sequester carbon there, just a small change as much as a 4 per mil, so putting 4 atoms of carbon in the soil per every for every 1,000 of carbon atoms already present in the soil, it would actually make a big change in the atmosphere. And so if we look here at this table that we produced a few years back in a publication accounting for the decades between 2004 and 2014, and I like to point that out because the numbers in the atmosphere and the number of emissions are actually changing yearly. And so it's important to to indicate to what period we are discussing. But let's say for that period, the atmospheric carbon stocks was on average about 414 gigatons of carbon, and gigaton is basically 10 at the 15 gram, is a lot of carbon. But if you look at the carbon that is stored in soils, in the topsoil or to the entire soil profile down to 1 meter, you actually get a lot of carbon. Is 1,500 is estimated of gigaton of carbon present in the world soil, so just in the 0 to 1 meter depth. And so the idea was that if we manage every year to put again, 4 atoms every 1,000 that are there, what will end up is to add about 6 gigaton of carbon every year. And that compares about to 2/3 of the total emissions that humans are putting into the atmosphere from combusting fossil fuel. And so that can be a significant dent. However, the question is, you know, how feasible is that? And have been a lot of studies that looked at the how much carbon can we actually sequester in soils if we implement worldwide what we call climate smart practices. And you know, you can imagine different studies coming to slightly different conclusions, also depending on what kind of land they considered. But overall, there is a pretty good agreement among all those studies that globally, we can sequester between 0.5 and 1.5 gigaton of carbon per year in our soils if we implement worldwide regenerative practices. And so that's not the 6 gigaton I showed you before, but it's still substantial and it's still very important to focus our attention to this. Also because sequestering carbon in soil is important not just for the climate, but for productivity of the land, its sustainability moving forward, and in general for the human well-being, for all the benefit that come by both mitigating climate change and increasing soil quality. So again, the 4 per mil needs to be taken almost as a slogan. So it's not likely that we'll be able to acquire 4 per mil carbon every year in the soil, but we can, if we focus on that and do what it takes, we can at least accrue 1 gigaton and have a lot of benefit from that. And so how should we look at this problem? How can we sequester carbon in soils? In a way, it's relatively easy, right? It's a balance. And so in order to sequester more carbon in soil, we need to start by putting in more. But then we can also reduce the losses by protecting the carbon that we put in. And finally, one thing that it can be very effective is by modifying the way in which the carbon is processed by the microbes, increase the efficiency of that processing so that for every unit of carbon that we put in, we have more staying. And our scientists and practitioners have actually quite a bit of understanding of what are the practices that can bring to those endpoints. And so increasing inputs, now we know that intensifying and diversifying production by, for example, using cover crops, continuous rotation, perennialization, but also doing some, deeper rooting plants by perennialization, but also, for example, by breeding of conventional crops. And I'm particularly interested right now also in integrating livestock in croplands and for sure also using amendments, organic amendments like manure, compost, or biochar. Similarly, we know a lot about how we can decrease disturbance and outputs, in particularly conversion to no-till or minimal till, but also maintaining cover and using the operating on the landscape in a way to reduce erosion. I would say that increased efficiency is currently more in the realm of research, but there are a lot of avenues that are looking at, in particularly to a combination of nutrient management, or including legumes and managing for microbial efficiency and microbial connectivity with the plants, that we could increase the efficiency of that transformation and maintaining more carbon into the soil per unit inputs. But maybe the point that I also like to make, one is for sure that all these practices and the management will need to be adaptive to the land, and needs to also, we should focus on the more degraded land and the land that have more capacity for further accrual. So it's not the same everywhere. But also I would point that it's not the same in terms of carbon. And that is maybe more my signature study from my scientific work, is that when we consider carbon sequestration, I think we need to go beyond just thinking about bulk soil carbon. And we need to think about how the carbon get distributed between at least these two fundamentally different pools of organic matter, which are the particulate and the mineral associated organic matter. And that is because they form from different processes. The particulate form more from the residues, and the mineral associated form more from the soluble input and microbial necromas. But also because they are very differently vulnerable to disturbance and management, and at the same time have different potential for sequestration. And I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to discuss for sure this more and respond to your question.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Next up on the list, we have Mario Tenuta. If you are there, we are ready for you, Mario.
Great. Thank you, Kara. Can you see my title slide?
You betcha, we sure can.
Okay, 4 per thousand, saving us all. We could use a lot of saving right now, can't we? Let's dive into the Canadian aspect here. Francesca did a great job in giving us a great overview on the practices and the foundations on the 4 per mil idea. In Canada, our soils, particularly in the West, like where Calgary and Edmonton and where I am in Winnipeg, blessed with incredible soils on grasslands that had a lot of organic matter to begin with. Well, since cultivation, since the time that we have done cropping on our prairie soils, we've lost carbon. That carbon was quickly lost, and then kind of stabilizes to equilibrium. And actually, of late, we've actually started to bring the carbon content of generally the soils up through change in practices that we'll talk a bit more about. Now, it depends on the soil that we're dealing with. So we take a black chernozem, which is more in line with what's up around Edmonton, compared to brown chernozems, which are a bit Calgary and east of Calgary. And it's quite different starting point for carbon, and the decline has been different. And also their potential to build is going to be quite different. Obviously, the soils that had high organic matter to begin with, they have the potential to regain carbon based with new management practices, and those that were lower to begin with, well, they don't have quite the same extent and that potential. And we'll show that in a moment. It's easier to lose than to win, obviously, as in real life, but also with soils, easier to lose the carbon than to gain it back. So it's a tough job to gain that carbon back, but we can with practices. One practice that we've improved upon in the prairies is to reduce the number of fallow years in a rotation. That's when we are not cropping. So now we have more years where we're cropping, and there's actually an input of root and residue carbon to the soil. And you can see here quite a decrease in the acres across the prairies. Well, this is for all of Canada, the majority of this is the prairies in terms of the fallow. So that's had an impact on improving our soil health and increasing carbon. Another is our tillage practices, and in particularly that's called here no-till seeding or direct seeding in the orange, increasing over time, where now it's probably the norm or the majority. This is for all across Canada. So on the prairies, in the more semi-arid and not so humid regions of the prairies, direct seeding is pretty much the norm for field crops, except for particularly in our clay soils like where I am at in the Red River Valley and in the Regina Clay Plain as well. This has had an impact on preserving carbon and particularly protecting carbon so that it isn't labile and prone to decomposition, and such as what Francesca was saying about the mechanisms by which can stabilize and keep the carbon in the soil. So we've done a really good job on the prairies of improving this. That adoption mainly happened in the 1990s and maybe early parts of the turn of the century. And elsewhere in Canada, the adoption hasn't been shown to really increase the carbon content to the extent that it has in the prairies. And now, so we have these two practices, direct seeding and removal of fallow. Many studies done by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in their series of research stations across the prairies took a look at this, and they found that on those more semi-arid soil zones, the carbon improvement is about 0.7 tons CO2 equivalents per hectare per year stored due to no-till, and under the fallow removal the same. Under the more humid areas, more on the fringes of the prairies and northern fringes, you start getting more carbon that had been stored, about 1.5 tons of CO2 equivalents due to direct seeding, and fallow removals contributions about 2.2 tons CO2 per hectare per year. So this is very interesting. It's really, we talk about no-till, but no-till happened at the same time with the reduction in fallow. And that was related with new technologies in terms of seeders, but also the advent of Roundup, okay, the herbicide control. And so they kind of went hand in hand, and both. So we've pretty much removed most of the fallow that we can. A lot of the fields are already in no-till. So for down the future, this has an impact in terms of how much carbon to be stored. An assessment, latest that I have from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, in green is the areas of Canada where soils are storing carbon, and in red where they're losing. The first thing that you see, it varies across the country. Here, it's that no-till and reduction in fallow, which is really bumping up the carbon. And in the east, it's a different story. We're actually losing carbon, even though there's conservation or no-till agriculture. Soils are quite different. There's more humidity or more soil moisture. And then there's other factors such as reduction in perennial fields for cropland. So in other words, terminating perennials and forage land and putting them into crops, corn, soybean, less production of cereals in Ontario and Quebec, which has and replacement by soybean, which has an impact on the carbon in the soil, and also urbanization as well. And when we look at the carbon gains across Canada in terms of related with agriculture and our soils, the carbon sequestration actually is starting to decrease. This is a bit controversial, but what happens is over time, the returns and gains in carbon that's stored starts to decrease as we come to a new equilibrium in terms of soil organic matter content. And as we can see, it's declining. And this is because, again, these gains decrease over time from the onset of no-till, conversion of pasture land to cropland, especially with some of our crops, such as canola, having good commodity prices. Some areas, urbanization, and like I said, in the east, particularly decrease in cereal production. Now, this carbon gains from in 2019, for example, in soil, amount to about 7.1% of the emissions from agriculture. So carbon gains in soil are actually accounted for differently than emissions of the greenhouse gases from agriculture, part of the IPCC reporting process. It's about 7.1% offset. So that's not bad, actually, but doesn't get us to the 30% that we need for agriculture by 2030. What maybe get us there, and Francesca overviewed in terms of climate smart soil practices, climate smart agriculture you've probably heard of with its pillars, and then climate smart soils. And in particularly, we're finding is nitrogen fertilizer management or 4R nutrient management can have incredible reductions in N2O emissions and can easily get about 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for our cropland on the prairies and also in Eastern Canada. Grazing management and livestock integration, cover crops and perennial crops can really significantly boost the amount of soil organic matter in soil. And another is naturalizing unprofitable areas such as wetlands or depressions in fields and get those to be naturalized and storing carbon in the landscape. So in other words, maximizing the carbon storage in the landscape by taking those areas that are really unprofitable, low rate of return on investment, and just naturalize them, get them out of agriculture and store carbon. That's what I have for you here. I hope we have a great discussion.
Thank you very much. And yeah, it is definitely an interesting conversation with many different aspects. Francesca, if I could get you to turn on your camera, then we will get into this second moderated part here. Okay, so we do actually have a couple questions in here. So thank you for those and keep them coming because we love to have your questions. That's what's so fun about being live here, to be able to answer you guys as they come up. So the first question here actually is going to be for Mario. The graph shows 30% loss of carbon for our black soil over 100 years. Do you predict that we could theoretically keep farming and regain back up to the original levels? If so, how long do you think it would take?
Great question. If we could get to back to the original soil organic matter, that'd be phenomenal. Right now, the thinking is to get back to that original organic matter content, we would need to go back to similar land use that was there before. So that would mean perennial cover, and not much removal of the carbon, which means you're removing carbon with grain and harvested products. Back then, the bison were doing the harvesting, but a lot of the carbon, some of the carbon was put back in the ground through feces and so forth. I don't think, and the models and research indicate that we're not going to get back all that carbon. We can for sure though increase and gain some of it back, and it depends on the level of the management. We've done a really good job with no-till and reduction in the fallow. That is definitely, we've gotten carbon back. Now the next thing is, what do we go to next? And I think the perennialization or covering the soil is going to be a really next big phase in this to get more carbon in the soil. So how much can I say? Back a third? I can say probably we can, oh, it's going to be tough. That'll be tough. I'm more interested in what Francesca thinks we can have, because it's really about equilibrium and the potential for stabilizing that carbon.
Francesca, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Mario that the key really is the fact that before agriculture, those soils saw continuous inputs and so diversified inputs with presence of legumes and roots at different depth and pretty deep root. And all of a sudden, they started seeing a little bit of input every, for the growing season and fallow for the rest. And so if we want to accrue that carbon, for sure, the use of cover crop, the intensification, trying to have as much biomass there as we can during the year. But the good thing now is that we understand a little bit better how soil organic matter is formed and protected and can persist. And so we can adapt management to the soil characteristics and think about doing different things. If the soil is more like a fine earth soil, or if it's a more sandy soils, different input can result in different efficiency. We can work more also with the microbial community and microbiome to increase that efficiency. And I would also point to the fact that the carbon story is definitely also a nitrogen story. And so we need to be thinking about the nitrogen fertilization and reducing that to limit N2O emission, but possibly including more legumes into rotation. And so it's hard to, for sure, I agree that we're not going to get back to the full carbon storage that they were there, but 1/3, I would say it's definitely feasible, and if we are wise and use the right approach, we could try to get even more than that.
Thank you very much. The next question here could go to either of you, so feel free to tackle it, but perennial crops seem to be a big option. What is the crop yield potential for a perennial crop compared to its annual similar version?
I might start that. I'm currently working with the Land Institute, and we have done some experiment looked at carbon stocks in the perennial wheatgrass and kernza. And for sure, the productivity is nowhere where you need for a grain production from wheat. But if you use it for you use it for diversifying and intensifying productivity, have period of perennialization in a rotation, or implement it also with livestock integration. I think there are several options that could see perennials already in the meantime, that hopefully the breeding can have higher productivity of grains, could already play a significant role. So for as much as I know, I don't think we are there for grain production. But that doesn't mean that perennials can also be seen for different reasons, like the sunflowers and other perennial grasses, not necessarily for grain production.
I agree with that. Think back, look at our barley, corn, wheat. The original yields were very poor, right? Hundreds, thousands of years ago. But through breeding, they have improved, and we are where we are now. The breeding of perennial grains is just at the very beginning. We have a perennial breeder here at the University of Manitoba. There are others. And I think with greater investment, there's a good opportunity. And then also the inputs can be quite different as well. And so it's also, there's the yield, but there's also the profitability as well to be looking at in terms of what makes a farmer make a decision to what they're going to grow.
We actually have a paper at the cover. I just thought that we submitted to the Canadian Journal of Soil on the perennial, and we do see an increase in the particulate organic matter. So they can definitely adding that much roots into the soil that can definitely result in carbon sequestration.
Now we have another interesting question here. Is alfalfa the type of perennial that will help restore soil carbon content, even if you are taking the upper part of the plants annually as hay? Does that change anything?
There's more and more understanding that below 5 centimeters, the majority of the carbon is from roots. And so as long as the plant is managed in a way that the roots stay live and productive and maintain soil structure and therefore also promote infiltration and stuff, I would think that for sure it's important to maintain topsoil cover and return as much as possible. And again, the animal introduction can help at least returning some of that carbon or using other amendments like compost and manure. But I think if we maintain healthy roots, that will go a long way. The other thing to consider is that we have bred our crops to actually have minimal root inputs and invest all their efforts above ground. And so what we do with harvest, we really take away the majority of the plant. When we do perennials, the majority will stay in the roots. And so the harvest will have a smaller, it will be a smaller cost, if you want, than harvesting annuals where they have no roots.
Okay, and to kind of follow up with that question, rent land out and the tenants like to take the grain and the straw as livestock bedding and it never returns. How damaging is that to the soil carbon content and productivity? Now, Mario, I see you're nodding over there. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, we've done a long-term carbon budgeting at our Trace Gas Manitoba research site since 2005, where we get net emissions of CO2 and nitrous oxide with some very fancy micrometeorological flux determination systems. And we are losing carbon in our system. We are losing carbon even with alfalfa, 4 years of alfalfa. And the key thing, I think, was that we did not have manure addition on that field. So we were aggressively taking as much mechanically harvested material as possible, like a good farmer would do. And but we didn't put manure back on the land. So this is really, really critical here, I think. Yes, so with those the removal of the straw, we're not going to get the grain back, of course, but the straw material, we can get that back. And there are other sources of carbon as well. Francesca mentioned biochar. I see biochar in here in the chat, and also compost as well, municipal composts and our as well. So there is an opportunity to bring it back, and then that's really critical to get to neutrality and to, in cases, get positive gains.
Okay, thank you. Moving on here, a question says, I believe I heard that there is a maximum amount of carbon that can be stored. It appears that the prairies are closer to this maximum, but Eastern and Atlantic Canada has greater capacity to store. Is this correct? Or if it is not, do you guys have any follow-ups to that?
Well, I think we need to be careful with a maximum. The maximum is a new equilibrium that is established based on the practices and the carbon inputs, outputs, stabilization, like what prevents decomposition and so forth. So if you change that mixture of factors, you can get a new equilibrium. Still not a maximum, like the maximum is put it into tall grass, mixed grass prairies and so forth like that, then over a number of years. But yeah, there's a new equilibrium that establishes with the ins and outs of the carbon and the stabilization. Now, in the east is interesting. It's more humid. I think that's part of the picture here. And their winters are more mild. So you can have decomposition occurring over the winter when there's not much plant productivity. So it's a little bit of a different mixture, things going on there in the east. And there's been research about earthworms even, that the much more earthworms in the east are moving that carbon and allowing it to, mixing it into the soil to decompose faster. Whereas on the prairies, we don't have the earthworms. So there's reports on that. I haven't done research on that.
And if I can interject a second to this, so Mario is perfectly right that, you know, the soils reach different equilibrium depending on how we manage them. But then there is also, and that's where the separation of the soil carbon into the particulate and the mineral associated organic matter, there is also a finite capacity of soils for how much mineral associated organic matter they can sequester. And the problem is that that depends on the texture of the soil, on the climate, and so forth. And so the MAM does reach a maximum saturation, the mineral associated organic matter, but the POM can potentially increase. And the other thing to consider is that the soils at depth is largely under capacity. And so for sure, there is a lot more carbon that we can put in even in the mineral associated organic matter.
Now, I realize we have kind of answered this question, but I'd like you guys to maybe go into a little more depth to clarify here. The question is, what could be done in Eastern Canada? Now, this was kind of what Mario was saying, to move from carbon loss to retention in the soil, red to green in the visual Mario shared. Is no-till still beneficial in those soils? And if not, are there better management practices for those contexts and soils? Would there be more of a focus on enhancing the robustness of the microbial community, as Francesca has mentioned? Any thoughts, maybe Francesca?
Sorry, can you repeat? There was an emergency out. I had to respond.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so the question here is, what could be done in Eastern Canada to move from carbon loss to retention in the soil? So in the visual Mario used, it was red to green. Is no-till still beneficial in those soils? And if not, are there better management practices for those contexts and soils? Would there be more of a focus on enhancing the robustness of the microbial community, as Francesca has mentioned?
So for sure, if you want to increase carbon, you have to have inputs. So reducing, no-till, if you don't increase the inputs, can only reduce the losses, but it will not increase the stocks. And the same is working on the microbiota. So the most important things is increase productivity, increase inputs. And that comes from what we've said before, intensifying the rotation, having cover crops, trying to have cover throughout the year with perennialization, as well as returning manure and compost to the soil. So that's the most important thing, is the input. And then there is the make those inputs staying more efficiently into the soil. And that's where the microbe can play a role, the microbial community, microbial connectivity, increase the carbon use efficiency so that you have more carbon staying in. And finally, and that is also achieved by reducing disturbance with no-till. So no-till is still very important, but by itself cannot increase soil carbon, can stop the losses, can reduce the losses.
Mm-hmm.
Mario, anything to add? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So in the East, if you want to call it the East, not sure Ontario's the East, but it changing the practices, but changing the crops and the management. So like Francesca said, changing the input. So the cover cropping, maybe intercropping, but having the soil covered in green in the fall and the spring is important. Underseeding can be done, and it is done in Southern Ontario. And that will provide carbon through more of the year. So we call it shoulder seasons. You get rid of those shoulder seasons so that they're actually building carbon as well. And we see it with our cover cropping here that as soon as we harvest, the soil becomes a net loss of carbon through respiration, because there's no more photosynthesis unless we have volunteer from the seed that we that we didn't harvested that grew in the fall. But most years we see respiration, and we see the respiration again in the spring. But as soon as we cover crop, and if the cover crop survives over the winter, we can see it becomes a net sink as soon as it starts to warm up above zero, well, about 5 degrees. So we can see it there. So there's a greater opportunity for that to work in Ontario, Quebec, and Maritimes, and they are doing that. There's great uptake in cover cropping, or at least better than on the prairies, because it's a bit more practical and more consistent to achieve the establishment of the cover crop. The other is bringing back cereals like winter wheat. So corn, soybean became the dominant rotation, and the winter wheat became less and less important as a dominant crop. And then with the commodity prices and a shift in cattle production to the west, to the prairies, we have less pastured animals, a lot less backgrounding happening and finishing happening in the east, becoming more dependent on the west. And then there's urbanization. You can imagine putting in a subdivision is a great way to get rid of a lot of soil organic matter extremely fast. And so there are some things there. So I think the key thing is let's get some of the winter cereals in there, and keep promoting the cover cropping. Was no-till good or bad? Good no-till is definitely good because it improves soil health. Is it improving the soil organic carbon? It's debatable. We thought yes at one time, but then when we looked deeper in the soil in the east, found out there was loss of carbon with depth. So, but the improvements in soil health are unquestionable. Getting organic amendments in is possible. I mentioned here about biochar. If we go that route, it's not as common as in the United States, biochar, in terms of as an alternative fuel, but that could be potential a means to sequester carbon.
So you have also mentioned underseeding, Mario, and a question just came in. Can you talk a bit more about underseeding? Is the practice common? What is the timeline?
Well, the classic in Ontario is underseeding with red clover. So underseeding in corn, maybe in wheat too. So that's the seed can be broadcast early summer with the rains. It's more humid there, so they can get established underneath the crop. Once the crop is harvested or senesces and the canopy opens up, then they can continue to grow, and they get some nitrogen fixation. If there's lots of nitrogen kicking around in the soil left over from the crop, then they can take up that nitrogen and prevent it from leaching. So inclusion of organic matter as well. So that's a practice that goes back decades now in Southern Ontario in the corn areas. So been extended with other cover crops. I think this idea in areas on the prairies maybe our ticket to establishing the cover crop, because it's a bit risky to establish cover crops with our harvest and early falls. So if we can get the crop kind of established, even if it's small, while the crop is still there, then it's ready to take off if there's rains. Once we harvest, then we have a better chance of establishment.
Now, do you want to elaborate on one more quick question here? Potential sources of biochar in Western Canada? We talk about how this kind of occurs more in the US, but what are some of these sources of biochar here in Canada?
Well, the first one that comes to mind is our wood, or is our lumber products and wood that we have a tremendous amount of. If we were to, by pyrolysis, produce biochar and use it as a heat source, then we would have that. Lots of areas in the US are using perennials, high biomass perennials, to use them for through pyrolysis. And so they have a tremendous ability to with roots, put carbon into the soil. So yeah, it's just not one of those things that really has, could be with incentives. I do know that, 2 decades ago, there was a lot of discussion about biochar in Canada on this, but we have quite a diversity of energy sources available to us, especially where there's hydroelectric. And then for a while, natural gas was very cheap and abundant. And so there just didn't seem to be that much innovation in that area. But I'm not an expert in that, so please don't say I'm the authority on this by any means.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely.
Another thing about biochar, we did some work before, again, in the Rockies here. For example, the pine beetle kill wood was a significant potential as a source. But one thing I want to stress about biochar is that it can be effective if the entire life cycle analysis of the char is carbon neutral. And so it has to do a lot with, again, alternative use of the feedstock, and then the way in which it's transported, the pyrolysis, and the way in which it's added. And so the final addition can bring carbon sequestration, but that's about 50% of the initial carbon. And so if that initial carbon has been lost to the atmosphere in different ways, you might, or there are other use of that initial feedstock that can be more effective. It's not necessarily a win, the biochar. It can be depending on how it's produced and transported.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here for you, Francesca. 4 per 1,000 is supported by various global organizations, but are the changes in operations choices measured accurately by all the IPCC methodologies?
The measurements and the verification of carbon sequestration is the hottest topic of research right now, at least in the US. We have what is called the MRV, the measurements and the verification tools being trying to be improved, and there is a lot of land for improvement for sure. By now we don't have yet the best methodologies, because the methodologies that we use in science are too expensive, too time consuming. We can't think of using them for extensive, and particularly here we're talking of carbon markets, and so they want to maintain the cost low. If you only rely on modeling, you are not going to have the degree of accuracy that you need in your estimates. And so we are currently working on that, on finding the right balance between accurate measurements that are well coupled with the ecosystem model and decision support tool that can use those measurements and produce reliable results, and then trying to do verification down the road on at least at the regional scale or at the scale of different crops and different ecoregions. But yeah, we're still working on that. I wouldn't say that we have the results right now. We have the right tools right now.
The next question here, it says, if our soil carbon is increased by a ton per hectare in a year, that is potentially a pretty small number in carbon value dollar per ton. Have we seen global policies that are designed to encourage use of perennials or other operational changes rather than just a carbon price in a market? Anyone have thoughts on that?
I don't think we have seen policies. Right now, I'm working on several proposals for, the USDA put out a $2 billion program to incentivize climate smart commodities. So I think it's coming down the road. It's still at the interface of supporting producer to make the change, as well as studying the effect of the changes and how we quantify the benefits. So we are still there, but it's very, it's changing by the day. It's a very hot topic right now. And so policies, I think, are down the road.
One aspect that maybe, and it's not so much a policy, but it's more consumer choice. For example, if consumers were interested in grass finished beef or so forth, then that could be a motivator. But you have to do a life cycle analysis, but you have to be careful because the enteric emissions of methane from the cattle on the grass, on the pasture, may or may not offset the carbon gains in the soil. So it needs to be done very carefully there. But I do think the consumer has a role here, as it always does in food production choices. But it's going to be more intense and directed to how food is produced. So, for example, having food with a climate smart soils or climate smart agriculture moniker on it may be enticing people. Currently, we have organic foods, but there could be also a direction to climate friendly foods.
I'm not sure what's the situation in Canada, but for example, there is the status quo in the US, for example, of the crop insurance, that if anything is making the change harder for farmers to apply. So it's not just the incentive, it's that often the status quo doesn't facilitate the change.
It's a similar issue in Canada with crop insurance. The provinces are becoming more listening more to the farmers and seeing how or when they can start making adjustments to the insurance policies as soon as there's some level-based adoption for practices. So a key thing is the most earliest adopters may not be in luck, but once there's more that join them, then the insurance providers need to provide the service, right?
Now, this next one, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to answer or not, but I'm going to pose it anyways. This person says, it seems ironic that the agricultural section doesn't have enough carbon while the oil industry has too much. Is there any research being done to connect the two?
Yeah, I was seeing that. I was going, wow, that's interesting. Interesting thought. When the issue with fossil fuels is its legacy carbon that we've now made labile in the biosphere, right? That's the issue, right? It was socked away and sequestered, and we've unsequestered it. Now, to take that sequestered carbon from fossil fuels and sequestering it into soils, geologic sequestration is, to me, is a surer bet and more efficient than the soil bet. But it's a good question. I'm not sure if there's byproducts that could be done, but I don't have an answer.
I like
Yeah,
to
that's
twist it in a different way, which is, and on the other hand, you know, I don't think you can bring the fossil fuel carbon into the agricultural soils, but now we can look at agricultural landscapes in the future to both bring carbon to the soil and produce energy. And for example, there are some interesting agrivoltaic projects where you can have both solar panel and livestock on a ranch and produce both energy and cattle, so or sheep or other form of livestock. And that's kind of, I found it very interesting moving forward.
absolutely. Now, I don't know, Mario, if you remember exactly what your last slide is, but someone says, what are the impediments to implementing the practices shown on Mario's last slide? Is it cost?
Well, for some, it will be costs, practicality, or an incentive for the farmer to implement them. So usually the incentive is some kind of return on investment today or tomorrow. You know, it could still be the health or the value of the farm, of the land. That's still a return. So there's that return. So what can provide that? You know, there could be a market for the carbon in terms of carbon offsets, or a national carbon market. We're very slow in this regard in Canada. Alberta was actually probably the leader in Canada, where we're going to a national system, supposedly, for carbon trading. So we do need some kind of a system in place to be able to do the trading, so that farms can tie into it. So that's an important one. Some cases we just don't know enough information about the benefits of the practices and how much carbon or greenhouse gases they can offset, or improvements in soil health. That research needs to be done. In some cases, we don't have quite the development, and let's say, for example, in the prairies, about cover cropping on the prairies. We just don't have it perfect yet. And so there's a mixture there, for sure.
Okay, and that is unfortunately all we have for time. Mario or Francesca, any last minute thoughts you would like to provide? No?
Yeah, I think the 4 per meal is it's a great initiative. Don't take it literally, but we do need to bring carbon into the soil.
Okay, sounds great. Well, thank you both very much for your time. I know I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I know a lot of our audience did as well, judging by some of the questions and comments that came in. So thank you very much for your participation. We appreciate it very much. For those of you that maybe caught on halfway through or had to leave early, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording. So as well, you can watch this over and over again if you so would like. Information on upcoming webinars and the Simpson Center for Food and Agricultural Policy can be found at www.policyschool.ca/webinars. So be sure to check that out. And I know we have quite a few upcoming webinars, so please tune in for those, and have you guys a great Tuesday. And as well, happy Canada Egg Day to everyone.